It's my pleasure to be here. I will share some views and propositions, basically based on the right to the city and the Mexico City Charter. We have been working on that for the past 5 years or so. But of course, referring to situations and instruments and issues in different countries in Latin America too, and some international also documents and processes going on, because it's all related. So if you're familiar with Latin America cities, you will know that this is a very common picture, not only in Latin America, actually, in many other parts of the global south. So happy to have you here with your experiences and your interest. And I don't need to explain much about that, but basically the urbanization process in Latin America took place especially between the 50s and the 70s. That was like the peak, with differences in different countries, but that was basically the main peak of the urbanization wave. Now taking place in Asia and Africa later, but a quicker pace and under much more, I could say, precarious conditions, both in the sense of not having an industrialization process that in Latin America, of course, was not perfect, but at least was having some conditions to offer some possibilities of work, etc., for migrants from the countryside. But in Africa and Asia, the situation is very different, also related with the state and the institutional capacities, capabilities, and also, of course, related with the globalization and the much more connectivity between all the places and the global crisis and all that. And it's a very different situation from the 50s and the 70s now. So basically, the experience in Latin America, and you can see that picture is from Mexico City, but could be from Caracas or Sao Paulo or Rio or any place. And basically, you can see the houses having like 2 or 3 stories already and being painted like with colors. So for the people, that took many years to finish that. But for them, they're finished houses, right? They're already complete. And basically, that was obviously through organization, with collective organization at neighborhood levels, but also related with, in many cases, at least in the Latin American situation, related with the democratization processes, both at city level but also national level. So if we were thinking about 60s and 70s, in many Latin American countries, there were dictatorships. And working in the favelas and helping the organization of the so-called urban poor was key in building stronger organizations at the local level and in pushing for political change, both at the local and national level. And I can give you some examples. In the case of Brazil, it's very clear, and we'll see that to the right to the city propositions also, in the case of Mexico, but also in the case of Argentina, many other countries. And actually, there are some victims of the dictatorships, murders, working in those popular neighborhoods. There are many cases, even nuns and priests and other people from civil society organizations, human rights organizations, working in those neighborhoods that have been targeted because of the political work they were doing. So that could be a question also for the situation in Asia and Africa now, to what extent the process of consolidation, the physical organization, the consolidation of the neighborhoods will be related, or is related or not, with the political struggle and the democratization struggle in those countries. This is just a very general issue, but we can see some things in common. And of course, we all know that this is part of our cities too. This is not only a video game kind of image, like a futuristic kind of picture, but that's a reality. That's also coming from Mexico City. And that's part of a huge, of course, real estate and so-called urban development projects that's in the west part of the Mexico City. Of course, related with transnational capital and transnational companies, et cetera, but with kind of no city idea. I mean, no city, no urban vision behind that. Only the idea of huge buildings, all very similar, by the way. Actually, the picture should continue that double or even triple that big. And no public spaces, no transportation, no facilities at all, like community facilities. And people living inside those buildings, basically taking the car, going out to the office or whatever. Even some of them are working in offices nearby. So, and then enter again to the car and enter again to the building, and not having much connections and interactions outside. And the only public spaces you can see down there are the shopping malls. Those are basically the interactions they have. For us, it's also, and of course we can see that in many, many places all over the world, especially related with the neoliberal kind of agenda, and for the past 25, 30 years, and the so-called withdrawal of the state in regulation of the land use and the land prices. Still, we need to take a look again of that picture and think about the role of the state in making that possible. No? And also the role of the state in building cities, basically building houses. That's part of the housing policy in Mexico. That was the key of the housing policy in Mexico for the past 10 years. Basically creating more problems than solutions. Now, according to the last census, we have 5 million empty houses in the country. 5 million empty houses. But of course, we still have a huge housing problem, lack of housing for poor people, because those houses weren't made for the poor people. Although they are called social housing, basically you were required to have a proper job with social security and savings and all that to access to the loan from the banks, the credit system. So basically, living out of that policy, the only national housing policy, more or less, living out 40, 60, 50% of the population. Those people that are now, according to the official numbers, working in the so-called informal economy. So official numbers saying that 50% of the population, even more, working in the informal economy, but then the official housing policy is not relating with that at all, just attending a few parts of the population. Basically now it's a disaster, and they are now recognizing that. Finally, it's a disaster in ecological terms. They are basically outside the urban skirts and destroying ecological and forest and places to get the water supply. I mean the refill of the water supply. And also agricultural lands. In many, many cases, there were agricultural lands. So even in some cases, you still can see the design, the official sign, saying this is according to the urban planning, whatever, land, etc. regulations, this is agricultural land. And then you see the houses. So basically, they're housing plantations that they are having now. So it's a disaster. It's a disaster because these units, I mean, this new kind of villages, but they are not villages. They're huge. We are talking about 20,000, 30,000, even 70,000 houses without an idea of thinking in a city, like really having a city. Just having houses, few community, infrastructure, very bad conditions of the infrastructure, and few facilities for the community in terms of sports and markets, schools, health centers, etc., and no transportation, and being 30 or 40 kilometers far from the the city, the real city. So it's a disaster. Now, finally, they're seeing that in a more critical way. They're saying that they will stop that. But we have, in those settlements, many of them have like 30%, 40% of occupation, and the rest is empty. So imagine living like in a ghost town, out of in the middle of nowhere. No? And this is actually a model that was copied from the Chilean model many, many years ago, and they're implementing that same model in Brazil, in some Central American countries, but also in South Africa and other countries around the world. So this is a very successful kind of model they are trying to sell, or they were trying to sell till few years. So basically, regarding those pictures again, and thinking about the no city we are building. No? The poor are building no city because they don't have basically other options, not because they want to build those houses in the middle of the hill, right? And the private sector building those big buildings without city, and the public sector building those houses. Thinking again about the need of the right to the city and the propositions and the view from the right to the city. Of course, related with the thinking and propositions back in the late 60s, and focus on the use, the use value of what we call the social function of property and land, and the right to participate in the decision-making processes, not only at family scale or neighborhood scale, but even the city scale, the city level. And specifically not from an individual point of view, but more from a collective point of view. And that's basically the idea Harvey is taking back again to the table, saying that this is not just another human right. It's not just adding one human right to the list. This is a different one. And why? Well, because different components, but basically is trying to change the rules of the system, in the sense that the regulation of the land and the prioritization of the private ownership, both in policies but also in the legal system, as in the top of everything, no? And actually having conflicts with other human rights in the name of the private ownership, in defending the private ownership. And for us, it's also like, let's say, could be a radicalization of the human rights approach and the democracy approach, not just in a liberal Occidental kind of tradition, but trying to go further in that direction. We don't have all the ideas, all the methodologies, all the plans to do that. We can kind of see that possibility inside the right to the city propositions. And one of the radicalization paths could be through the territorial approach. So not just thinking about democracy in a very abstract terms, or having some kind of elections or etc., or some representatives, or just far from the people, from the neighborhoods, and also the human rights, not just thinking about different issues, different themes, or different actors, but in a territory. So when you see things from the territory, as you know, you have conflicts, and then you need to see how to deal with those conflicts between rights, actually, and between the exercise of the democracy and the possibilities of exercise of democracy. So, very simple way, the definition we are using, both in the international, the Global Charter on the Right to the City, but also in the Mexico City Charter and in other documents of the right to the city, again, in a very, very simple way, is the equitable use and enjoyment of the city. And we put social justice on top of the list, because the other things, actually, you can still read those under a very liberal and even neoliberal agenda, in a very weak way, of course. But so we want to talk still about social justice, related with the other, of course, equity, democracy, and sustainability, but from a different approach. So basically, some of the documents that are talking about the right to the city are both civil society documents, declarations, etc., but some official documents too. And as you can check the dates, the civil society documents, they arrive usually before the official documents, and that's okay, it's not a coincidence. Some of them are more local, some of them are more international, even gender approach to the right to the city. And the official documents, also you have some of local level, included the Montreal Charte, but also national level, in the case of Brazil, regional level, international level. And some of them are like legal binding documents, like the city's Statute in Brazil is a legal document related to the Constitution and being like, I'm not a lawyer, so I don't know how to say that in proper terms, but being above all the laws related with that. The case of the National Constitution in Ecuador also. They were based, I mean, the proposition on the right to the city for the Ecuadorian Constitution were based on the Global Charter for the Right to the City. Actually, they copy-paste more or less the same contents about the definition, etc. And also the Mexico City Charter, I will talk about that in a minute, and the Global Charter Agenda for rights in the city. I mean, also a parallel process with the Mexico City Charter, but different in some ways. And perhaps one of the main differences, well, I will talk about that in a second, but it's the conceptualization of human rights in the city and the right to the city. And they are quite different in the implications. So based on all those documents and processes, we were developing the right to the city in Mexico, starting in almost 60 years ago. And so the charter is based on that, but also has some specific and some different components and characteristics. One being that was actually a proposition from not only the civil society, but the social movements and the urban social movements in Mexico City. We are working with them. We've been working with them for the past 30 years or so, talking about different issues and human rights approach, et cetera, to housing rights, and sharing with them the agenda, the international agenda on the right to the city, and basically they decide, well, this is actually a good idea to try to implement something at local level in Mexico. So they made a first agreement with the government to try to develop a charter, a local charter. And so the center-left government in Mexico City, they say, yes, why not? And for the social movement, actually, since the beginning, the idea of developing a charter, and when I say charter in English, I mean a declaration. It's not like a constitution. But actually, from the origin, the idea and the goal of the social movement was actually to have a constitution for the Mexico City. Because now Mexico City has like a kind of a weak and strange legal status within the country. It's the federal district, and it's big. It's really big. It's, I mean, the size of Sweden. It's like 9 million people living in a city which has actually, it's not a municipality, of course, but it's either like a provincial level. And it's a federal district, so it's the federal government, the national government, has a lot of power in the definition of certain policies in the city. So it's a very weak, strange legal situation, legal status. So, and also, of course, there are differences in the parties, in the ruling parties, at national level and the local level. So based on all those elements, for the social movement, actually, the idea of having a local constitution was very important from the beginning, and the charter will be like the base for that. So different kind of activities. Finally, the charter was signed by the different authorities, local authorities and civil society representatives almost 3 years ago. And of course, now the issue is related with the implementation, not just having the charter, which is actually a very simple document. You can access this. It's available not only in Spanish, but also in English. And we are finishing the translation into French. Basically having not just ideals and dreams about the city we want, but how to make that possible, and concrete actions that not only the government, but the different actors in the cities should take to make that possible. And of course, knowing that we are not starting from zero, and there are many already in place policies, social policies, especially at city level, that are dealing with the right to the city, or we're trying to implement contents, many contents of the right to the city. So basically, we need to analyze those, but from another perspective, and basically try to connect the different actions at local level in the territory to make those more explicit, oriented to fulfill the right to the city. But there are many things already going on, and you will see some of them. That's only to say that what different kind of organizations involve, not only in the elaboration of the charter, but also in signing the charter and being compromised with implementation of the charter. Although we try our best to make a very participatory and open process, you should know, especially if you were in Mexico City, that if you are on the street and you ask anyone, like in Montreal, I think could be the same case, I'm not sure, but if you ask any citizen on the street, about the charter, well, probably they will say no, right? Because there is still a very limited dissemination. Although there were some things in the public plaza in the Zócalo for many years, and there were things on the metro, 4 million and 4.5 million individuals are taking the metro every single day, and there were some, announces there, but still it's not, of course, it's not sufficient. But there were different kind of organizations involved, including some academic institutions, of course, and professionals. And also you can imagine, just to say, you can imagine the different issues coming from the different kind of organizations and try to deal with all those and still have a simple, readable document. That was quite a challenge. So trying now to explain the different components of the right to the city for us, and actually the way they are organized, the propositions are organized around those main elements. And some of them are related, the top 3, let's say, are related with the previous documents. The Global Charter, the Brazil Cities Statute, and also the Lefebvre conceptualization of the right to the city. But we are taking into account other propositions coming from other parts of the world, and especially from a southern, let's say, and more social movements point of view of the right to the city. We were adding also these 3, the bottom ones, and I will explain the contents. So the first one is basically the realization of human rights in a territory, and in this case, in a city. That's usually the understanding of many of the, including the Global Charter, many of the documents dealing with human rights in the city. That's basically the approach. I have tried to realize those, and not talking about the right to the city, no? Just human rights in the city. So they already recognize human rights, and how to deal with that from a local point of view, and changing or accommodating the public policy at local level to the national obligations according to human rights. Of course, that's very important, and it's a huge issue and a huge advance in some cases, but it's not all for us. And one of the issues is the so-called interdependency, or I don't know how to say that in English, but the relation between all the human rights. Huh? And we know they are all interlinked, etc., but actually it's difficult to explain that. It sounds like very abstract for many people and on the ground. But on the other hand, if you ask any person, especially in the popular neighborhoods, about the rights and the possibility to fulfill the rights, they know, because they are dealing with that all the time, and they are all related. No? And basically, this is a slogan from a South African movement, Mombolo, I can't remember now the correct name, but it's a South African movement based in Durban at the beginning, but then spreading out in other cities. And the main slogan is that one. So for them, it's very clear that if you don't have a proper place to live, you don't have access to many other rights. But also there was a political tool, a political claim for them to say to the government, if you are not fulfilling our housing rights and our right to land, we are not participating in the democracy. And you know that in South Africa, that's a very key issue and can be a very powerful slogan to say we are not participating because we don't feel like full citizens in this society. And we don't want only vote, only the possibility to vote, but we need to fulfill other rights too. And of course, the land and the house is related to the access of many other possibilities, including jobs, including health, including education, etc., etc. So for the people, the housing rights and the territorial approach to human rights is very concrete in crystallizing the interdependency between the different human rights. But also from a more like a historic approach to developing of the human rights. We all know that's a process. It's actually a very long process, not starting just with the French Declaration, but formally with that declaration. And some of them, we still have it very present in our documents. But also, we think that from an urban approach to human rights, we need also other human rights. And we need to add other human rights, not just because adding to the list, adding one more to the list, but because it's part of the life today and the possibility to have a life with dignity these days. Of course, those applies the new ones, so-called new ones. They apply not only to urban citizens, to all citizens, but especially with specific characteristics in urban places. And so basically some authors are talking about the urban rights in the sense of developing a new framework from the human rights in an urban era. As you know, half of the population worldwide is living in urban settlements of different sizes. And the right to land, of course, is a very pending issue. There is no international document dealing with that, as you know. Only for indigenous people. They're now trying to develop something for the campesino community, but there is no international recognition of the right to land. So that's a pending issue, and of course relevant not only for urban population, but for the people living in the countryside, of course. The second one is for maybe the main one, in the sense that it's the most difficult to implement, and although the social function is recognized in many constitutions all over the world, and we are trying now to explore that in a more scientific way. We were trying to get some money to have a project to explore that and the conceptualization of the social function from the Latin American perspective, from an European perspective, but also in the countries related with Islam and under the Arab tradition, because there are similar contents in that. But of course, it's difficult to implement, and we all know why. And that's why of the main reasons. And so basically developing tools against the speculation, against the land grabbing, both in the countryside and in the cities. And here again, the contradiction between the right to property and the housing rights and the social function of property. So different components we need to put on the table again and analyze the situation. In many of our cities, especially the big cities, the capitals, we know that there are the same amount of empty buildings that the people that need a place to live. Of course, that's not a simple mathematical issue. It's much more complex than that, but still for us it's a political tool to say, well, there are empty buildings and there are people who need a place to live. So it's not only building more houses and eventually outside the cities and growing the peripheries, but to try to take a different look to the places we already have. And this is especially true in many Latin American cities, and especially in the historic centers. And also the social function related to the investment in the city. So usually when you talk about building more houses, they will say, we don't have money, no? Usually. We don't have any money. not for houses, not for community centers, etc., but usually they have money for those kind of things. And they have public money, not just private money. And some colleagues from us were studying that in the Commonwealth Olympics a few years ago in Delhi. Also, we have some colleagues studying that in Brazil now. There's a huge wave of evictions and things going on, and public investment behind those new infrastructure that usually they will become like empty and white elephants after those big shows. But also the regularization of the popular settlements, recognizing that they are there and they are building and they are fulfilling a right and they are actually solving a problem and a need, and not criminalizing those initiatives, but try to recognize that and support that in different ways through infrastructure, but also in legal terms. The third one is the more common one, the most common one, in the sense that usually when we think about the right to the city, we relate that with the right to participate in the city policy. But we are talking here not just about participation in the usual sense of very light kind of participation and consultation, but participating in the decision-making process at different levels through different kind of tools. You know those tools. Many of them are recognized in many countries, but others still not. I mean, like the popular or civil society legislative initiatives, those are not recognized in many countries. That's not possible. Or citizen audits, etc., etc. So we are talking about the real participation process and not just light consultation. The fourth one is actually the right to produce the city, because our numbers say that between the 50 and the 70% of the built environment in the city was made by the people, not by the state, not by the private sector. So basically, we have the right and we have the capacity as citizens, as organizations, to do that. But we need to do that in a proper way. And basically, for doing that in a proper way, we need access to land. So we are lacking land policy in many of our countries, or the land policy, it says the market will do it. So let the market do it. And so we don't have like a land policy for the people, for the poor people to access that. Of course, the technical support and the access to credit, etc., etc. And in many of those cases, of course, we're talking about individual or family-based initiatives, but some of those are also organized and collective. And when they are organized and collective, and in the case of Brazil, Argentina, Uruguay, and many other countries now, can be cooperatives or other kind of models, and they have the proper technical assistance, and they have access to proper land, and they have access to public funding, they can have those kind of results. Those are the cooperatives in Uruguay. So, and that used to be the case also in Canada and other northern countries. So having a system to support that, and not just a system to support the private and the market to do the things. And also what we call the productive habitat, in the sense of habitat is not just for living, but it's also to produce and to generate income for the poor people, and not just having these huge malls and always the same Coca-Cola and Walmart and those kind of business-oriented kind of markets and places, but also at community level and a possibility to create income for the poor people. So the need of linking the housing policy with the generation of income and the economic policy. The environmental issue, of course, is crucial for us, and when talking about the right to the city, for us, this is a main topic, in the sense that understanding the city not just about the constraint to the administrative or legal limits and borders, but understanding the city as a part of an ecosystem and the relations between the city and the other places nearby. And we know that when we're talking about the right to the city, we are not saying we want the city, those cities, that big buildings, gray buildings, etc., and destroying everything. I mean, we don't want that city. We want another kind of city. And also we want the right to live with dignity in the countryside. So we're talking about the right to the city. We are not saying everyone needs to go to the cities. We are saying we have the right to live in the countryside also. And for the past 40 years in our countries, I'm not sure in Canada, for the past 30 or 40 years in our country, have been no support to family scale production and to people to stay, and for the campesino, indigenous people to stay and to remain in the countryside and to have a dignified life in the countryside. So that's part of the struggle for the right to the city too, to change that rapport. Also not destroying the forest inside the city, on the surrounding of the city, because of the need of doing new highways to connect basically rich people living in the south, this is Mexico too, to work in the places in the west you saw before. So they're building this huge new highway, destroying the forest there, and there was some actually Jane's Walk organized in Mexico City last year to try to denounce that and say we don't want this, car-oriented initiatives in the city destroying the forest. Also the pressure, this is in Mexico, in the southern part of the Mexico City, beautiful landscape they call chirampas. It's a pre-Hispanic tradition of producing food, actually. One of the most productive ways of having food in the world. You can have four or five different cosechas, like harvest within a year. So there are very small plots. They gain from the lake. I can explain that later. But basically, destroying those landscape, the possibility to produce food in the city. So basically, needing to import the food from outside. And also, not only because of the lack of proper public policy, but also because of the pressure of the people in developing and building houses, especially for the popular sectors in Mexico City. Again, because of the lack of land policy and a social housing policy attending all the population. And also, we include in this sustainable management of the commons, not only the ecological, energetic, etc. components, but also the cultural and heritage issues, so important for our cities and so under attack under the neoliberal era, destroying everything. And the final one, I'm finishing, is related with the public spaces, basically. Understanding the public spaces, not only the streets or the parks, but also community centers and other kind of spaces managed by the people and by the communities. Understanding, of course, the different dimensions of the public space. In political terms, we all know that in our countries and the democracy is really related with the use of the public space in the sense of the demonstrations and rallies, etc., and many governments, you can just see the pictures of the Tahrir Square in Cairo and remember that, but we all know that that's a long-standing tradition. This was in Mexico also the new so-called president and the other candidate, the losing candidate, having his own rally and ceremony outside at the same time. And you can see there are more people outside than inside, actually, supporting them. But also the economic dimension of the public space. And this is, again, really important. There's a tradition in many of our cities and countries, again, under attack in many places. They are evicting not only poor people from the houses, but also evicting poor people from selling in the streets, and the regularization of the public space in that sense, and making actually very difficult to afford a place to rent, not only to live, but also to produce and to sell. So reclaiming that. Also, of course, the cultural dimension of the public space, very, very important. And gaining space from the cars. This is also Mexico City, reclaiming the public space for the people and for the enjoyment of the people and the meeting places, etc., and not just to travel from one place to another. And that's not from Mexico City, of course. But we all know also that the public spaces are under attack in the sense of privatization in many places. And so I'm not sure about that picture if they're talking about the parking lot or the snow, but in any case, they're privatizing the snow. But we know that that's a reality in our cities, and not only in the talking about the gated communities, for example, the rich gated communities, but also in the popular settlements. They are also closing the streets and closing and putting like jail kind of landscape in our cities. So we don't want that, and we know that that's the negation of the city, and the possibility of having a city life is to have open spaces. So that's the last one. That's related with the challenges of the implementation of the charter. Of course, there are many, many. And especially now, there's a new government. So the previous story was related with the previous government, actually, the developing of the charter. And now, since the beginning of December, there's a new government in Mexico City, the same party, but new person and new staff. And usually, when they get to the office, they want to change almost everything to say, I'm here, and this is, my government. And there is not a vision of like public policies in a long term in Mexico. And especially in Mexico City, although not only, but because Mexico City is like a national platform for candidates to be then presidents. So they want really to, make a change or show their specificity. So we still have those challenges going on. But now, just like 2 or 3 weeks ago, there was the first meeting, one of the first meetings with the local authorities to start talking again, not just about the implementation of the charter, but in a constitution for the city. There are different proposals, but one of the proposals is a draft, and was kind of a very exciting paper for us to see. The draft is like the proposition of the constitution is based of the charter, like article number 1, number 2, number 3, etc., etc. So actually, we will see, but that's a process already going on, and there is like the political will, so-called political will, to work on that. But also we need to continue the review of the legal instruments already in place and the policies, the public policies already in place. So not only to have a constitution can be really beautiful, but to have actually the implementation. And for us, those are parallel processes. We are not waiting to have the constitution to implement the contents of the charter. So we are working in a parallel path. Of course, with the dissemination of the charter, and because the charter is also for us not just a legal tool, but also a political, pedagogical tool for mobilization and for discussion and for debate, etc., and for capacity building, etc. So those are some of the strategies we are trying to follow.